So my topic is something I'm asked on occasion, where people ask, what does Judaism believe about, for example, God? What does Judaism believe oftentimes about the afterlife? What does Judaism believe about the soul? And I oftentimes have to say to people, the question is not formulated correctly, as if Judaism is something monolithic that has a kind of a catechism, has as if a synod met and all Jewish beliefs were ironed out. Now, synods did meet in Christianity, but that didn't stop the disputes. That didn't stop the claims of heresy. So over and over again, even a very doctrinal religion like Christianity has constantly had to re-meet and work out these doctrinal theological positions. Now, Judaism, as you know, did not begin as a doctrinal theological religion. As I've said, it's very hard to develop a theology from the Bible, because the Bible has, as Jack Miles has pointed out, many different depictions of God in the Bible. And therefore, we have images of the divine that are presented in contradictory ways. So if one were to say, what does Judaism say about God? I would say, for example, do you mean from the Bible? They would say yes. I would say we have at least 20 different depictions of God in the Bible, which is why you will notice my being rather pedantic when people say, God said the following, and I will say, you mean the depiction of God in this text says the following. We must always remember that, as I said earlier, from the idea of source criticism, now this is my belief, certainly an Orthodox rabbi would strongly disagree, although most Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist rabbis would agree. The text we have was written by human beings. I'm silent for now on what God has to do with that. Does God inspire the text? Is the text a refraction of the divine mind, not a reflection? But in any case, it's written by human beings at a certain place, in a certain time, to a specific audience with specific needs. So it is an historical text. This is sometimes called historical criticism. Remember, criticism from this point does not mean finding fault. It's a German word, critique, and I've discovered the best way to translate critique is opening up the hood and seeing how something works. So, for example, critique of knowledge, how does knowledge work? Critique of ethics, how does ethics work? So historical criticism would be assuming the Torah is an historical document. Let's go in that with critique, meaning unpack all of that and see how all of that works. So I start with historical criticism, again, not finding fault in, but accepting that texts come into being different places and different times. And therefore, any depiction of God in the text is a depiction by that author at that time for those historical purposes to a specific audience. And that's what we have to figure out when we read a text. For example, when were the 10 Commandments written? Now, in the story, they are, of course, put in the mouth of God, told to Moses at Mount Sinai, some short period after the Israelites leave Egypt. That's where it's put in the text. But the question is, who actually wrote that text? When did they write it? For what purpose? How does one find that out? Well, one looks carefully at the language of the 10 Commandments. One compares it to other linguistic strata in the Bible, and you try to fit the language of the 10 Commandments to language that seemed to be a similar language, and then ask ourselves, when would it have fit for Judaism to come up with the divine, revealing the divine self with a set of propositions? You might say core statements about Judaism. So many people see the 10 Commandments as being Deuteronomic, meaning although they are retrojected into the mouth of Moses soon after the Israelites come out of Egypt, that's you might say that's the so-called myth. Not mean it's not true, but it's a holy story that should orient our lives. From an historical critical perspective, it's probably written close to the time of Jeremiah. And then when the book we call the Torah is put together, that's where it was put historically. Now, we don't know when. Could be Jeremiah, could be early in the exile, could be Ezra. We don't know when, but by the time of Ezra, the text is fairly well put together. So therefore, when someone says the Jewish theology of revelation, which I'll be getting to in a few moments, for example, the Ten Commandments, my response would be, when was it written, by whom, to what audience, for what purpose? So I think it's the idea of revelation in Judaism is a much more complex question than simply taking the text at face value. All right. So now, in addition to there being, the biblical theology statements about God being a kind of a cacophony or jazz, as you might put it, then you go into rabbinic Judaism with the Talmud and the Midrash. That is a wild, woolly world of all kinds of statements about how God communicates with people. And my final statement about summarizing all of this, I think that the Torah tradition and the rabbinic tradition is much more of a philosophic anthropology, a meditation on the human condition, the nature of the human being, than trying to say anything coherent about the divine. When you look at all the narratives in the Bible and you look at rabbinic literature, there's a much more coherent theory of the human being. We call that a philosophic anthropology or a philosophy of the human condition. Then there is a coherent picture of the divine. So because I sense that in some way divinely inspired, it's written by human beings, reflecting on the human condition, where the depiction of God is one of the characters in the narrative. Why is the human being writing the story? Not to figure out God, but to figure out the human condition. This is the way I've been reading the Bible since, I'm going to have to say since my college days, a conscious choice as I began studying different biblical theory. And I'm only more and more persuaded of this idea as I go along. By the way, this doesn't mean that you have to believe this. Anybody listening here, you'll study the text and you'll come up to your own conclusions. I just want to be very forthright with full disclosure how I understand the Bible, which of course will influence how I see the idea of theology. Now, with all that said, when people say, what does Judaism believe? As you know, a couple of times ago, I started with what I call the core belief, the absolute first question that everybody has to ask before you take one more step in studying philosophy, religion, or Judaism. There's one step you have to make. And the step is not something that you can reason about, not something that the Bible tells you. It's an existential choice. And the existential choice is, are there better and worse answers to moral questions? You've heard this many times. I can't stress how important it is. Because if you don't believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions, that everything is fabricated, it's all relative to the person. Like Yuval Harari in his books, he very much has a sense of all morality is just a human fabrication. There's nothing real. We just made it all up. As you know, while I think he's a brilliant guy, I really disagree with that position. I truly believe that there are better and worse answers to moral questions. For example, the moral questions, do human beings have rights? That's a moral question. From a relativistic perspective, rights are invented by different societies at different times for different purposes, but there's no real thing called human rights. But if I believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and someone says, are there human rights? Then I'm going to say something about reality, not what human beings think, but about reality. And therefore, if you are a moral realist, your question is, how do we align human thought with what is metaphysically real, or Plato would say, in the ideal forms? So notice you choose one, you're going to go down one road. You choose another, you'll go down a different road. Now, there are several questions that you then place on top of that. Is that fundamental standard by which right and wrong are assessed, is it conscious? Okay, that's a question. Can we know its mind? That's a question. Does it know our minds? That's a question. Does it still communicate with us? You see, once you decide that there is a metaphysical standard for right and wrong, well, I'll call it moral realism, then there's a whole set of questions that different people answer. I have my own answers, but my answers aren't yours. I would just like you to meditate on this. If you believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and we're going to call that the standard for moral questions, then you can ask some questions about it. Now, the questions are not, and answers are not achieved through reasoning. In a way, they're setting up axioms. You can't reason yourself to an axiom. Axioms are set, and then you can reason from your axioms. So and how are these axioms developed? I believe they come from the soul. I believe we have to inquire of the soul. This is a kind of a moral intuition, which means my axioms are found within me in the realm of my soul. I use my conscious mind to investigate what my values and axioms are. They are very related. And I might find some incoherence there. I might not be very worked out. And that's why I read philosophy. That's why I read religion, because I want someone to help me think about my values and my axioms. My values might change. My axioms might change with the help of people that are smarter than I am, who've thought about this before. Now, with this in mind, when we get to ideas of ethics and revelation and so forth, you'll see that first you have to start with some sense of what is metaphysically true. I'm going to call this faith. Now, it's not the right word in my mind, but most theologians use the word. You start with faith. For example, I have faith that there are better and worse answers to moral questions. I have many beliefs about that are not provable to a skeptic. And once those things are set, then that generates a whole other set of questions. So anybody asks me this, I say to people, you have an existential choice to make. Are there better and worse answers to moral questions? You can't reason it. You can't prove it to a skeptic. You can't study anything that will tell you the answer. It's an individual existential choice. You can go one way or the other. Depending on which way you go, there are a set of questions that are opened up. I take the path there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and then I take that path. So I think that's a fundamental first question. Now, starting from that, okay, let me see how I'm doing on time here. Hold on a second. Yeah, my talk has begun. Last week, I believe I talked about one of the theological, one of the core issues in theology is God as creator. And then I read these wonderful statements on God creating the world out of nothing and so forth, really wonderful things, except that's not what the Bible teaches. So when I critique theologians who discuss God as creator, I go into the Bible and I find out it's not that simple. For example, the first two lines of Genesis are rarely translated as to what the Hebrew actually says. Then you go to the discussions of God creating in other parts of the Bible. You look at the synonyms of creation, the Hebrew word bara, yatzar, to shape, asa, to make. So you have synonyms that are used, and we have to look at those statements as well. So if I were to come up with, and I might, with a so-called composite of biblical ideas about creation, then I have to remember these are written by human beings in places and time. So I wouldn't say that the Bible teaches that God revealed the Torah at Mount Sinai. Somebody wrote that. Let's say Jeremiah, he didn't, but let's say for convenience sake. Is that what Judaism believes? I'll say is what he believed. And so therefore, that's Revelation, my next topic. But as far as creation, I have to look at many different places. So I won't say creation is Genesis chapter 1. Creation is talked about all over the Bible. We have to ask, who wrote Genesis chapter 1? I think I know. So you'll notice that when I read these theologians, creation, revelation, and redemption, the creation of the world, revelation of Torah, redemption from Egypt, I have many questions about those things. And for me, they don't form into a coherent theology. They actually form into something that is cracked in a good way. I mean, Leonard Cohen said, the cracks are where the light gets in. That's what I think. They're not consistent or coherent. All right, so when we're going to do theology, now, how much the more so when you get to rabbinic texts, when you get to Midrash, the Talmud, and so forth, you talk about creation, you get teachings that are far, far distant from what the Bible teaches. Now, I'm just giving a foretaste of what I might do earlier is actually lay all this out for you and what it means to immerse yourself in the text and assemble from the text a theory of creation, revelation, redemption, and not let somebody solidify it for you and give you a theology, but rather, from my mind, a more authentic thing to do, immerse yourself in the text and see what happens. All right, so my topic for tonight is revelation, partly because it comes next after creation, which I've discussed, and because we have the 10 Commandments in this week's Torah portion. So that we have, as it were, the revelation in this week's Torah portion. Now, I think you can see, I'm going to read a little bit to you of this portion, and you can see that whoever wrote this was theologically very conflicted. So I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy 4, and let's go to so now I'm in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 11. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 11. Now Moses is with the depiction of Moses remembering what happened in Deuteronomy, in Exodus 19 and 20. Of course, what we have is a text written in the late First Temple put into the mouth of Moses. So somebody in the late First Temple is saying the following in the character of Moses. You, meaning the people, came forward and stood at the foot of the mountain. The mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark with densest clouds. Verse 12, 4:12. Adonai spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sounds of words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a voice. Why would the author emphasize, you saw no shape, nothing but a voice? Because if you look in other parts of the Bible, for example, Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel sees the figure of a human being, an image, a temunah. So other parts of the Bible see a figure of the divine. This author says that's completely wrong. You were at the mountain, you saw no figure of the divine, you only heard a voice. This is a polemical statement against those who say that they have a mystical apprehension of a temunah, an image of what God looks like. Then it says in verse 13, chapter 4, verse 13, God declared to you the covenant that you are commanded to observe, Aseret HaDvarim, the 10 statements, inscribing them on 2 tablets of stone. At the same time, Adonai commanded me to impart to you laws and rules for you to observe in the land you're about to occupy. For your own sake, therefore, be careful. Again, since you saw no shape when Adonai spoke to you, the author says it again, not to act wickedly and make yourself a sculptured image of any likeness. This author is obsessed with no likeness, no image. You did not see anything at Mount Sinai, meaning today, don't say that you can image the divine. Okay, let me go back up to another section. Hold on a second, please. In any case, without looking for the text, in this text, there is a constant struggle between Moses, mediated the voice, and you heard it yourself. People said to me, you listen, tell us. And then the text says, and God spoke directly to you. And then the text says, and God spoke to me. So whoever is writing this text has deep ambivalence. Did only Moses hear the voice? Or did everyone hear the voice of all of the 10 commandments? Now remember, this is an author, or let's say around 600 BCE, trying to figure this out, giving a theology of revelation. So, so their question now is, what are some models of revelation? What are some options for you as you think about this? Because someone can say to you what you believe. You can say, well, minimally, I believe there's a moral standard and all that comes from that. Well, what do you believe about the text? An evangelical Christian might say, a certain kind of evangelical Christian will say, for example, all of the New Testament, every single word was dictated by God. I think that borders on the absurd, personally, because there's nothing in the text that suggests that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John are clearly, there's a human author writing the text. Now, we don't know if they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there is a human author. The letters of Paul are purported to be the letters of Paul. So if someone were to say, no, there actually is no four gospels, there actually is no Paul, it's all the very word of God, I think that's a very difficult position to hold. And there are many evangelical Christians who believe the New Testament is the word of God, but they don't hold that totalistic idea that every word is the word of God. By the way, when you go into Judaism, you have a similar struggle that I'll show you today. There are some believe that every single word and letter of the Torah is a dictated word of God. But believe it or not, even within Orthodoxy, that is the dominant, not the dominant point of view. So one thing that unites all of us here together is that we're serious about this. Meaning we're serious about the fact that there is God, from my perspective. For me, the fact that God is conscious, from my perspective. The fact that we can be conscious of God, we can experience God. God is conscious of us. And in some way, God reveals God's self to us, and maybe even God's will to us. So if I take those to be axiomatic, then there are certain things that when I study Torah and our tradition, certain things line up and certain things don't. And by the way, it's a constant dialogue. As I worked about my beliefs, the text has shaped me, and then I shape my beliefs about the text. And the text shapes me, and I shape my beliefs about the text. So this is a constant dialogue that's going on. So what I want to do now is put on the screen a section from a book that I strongly recommend that you read. It's the Cambridge Companion to Jewish Theology. I'm going to share one page from the book, the chapter 14 on Revelation, that I think is extremely useful. All right, so now we're going to go back to looking at whether my share screen skills are what they should be. Yay, look at that. All right, so hopefully you can see a shared screen that says, hold on. Alan Brill, in his book, says, hold on. He's quoting Catholic theologian Avery Dulles in his Models of Revelation, as modified by post-liberal evangelical mainline theologian Gabriel Facra in his Doctrine of Revelation. Brill is going to discuss the last 25 years of thinkers. So this is Alan Brill, chapter 14, Cambridge Companion to Jewish Theology. Now, Alan Brill continues. Dulles offers 5 different models of revelation. One is revelation as doctrine. So revelation is text that teaches something that we have to know. So for example, the New Testament. These are texts. We're not saying, how they were written. It could be revealed through human beings, the Hebrew Bible, how they were written, but it's doctrine that you have to know, expressed in a specific language at a specific time. It is the very word of God. There's another belief. This is much more a Jewish belief than a Christian belief, is that God reveals God's self in history. Emil Fackenheim, a great 20th century theologian, wrote a book called God's Presence in History, that God acts in history. So for example, the theme of redemption, that was God acting in history. So you look throughout Jewish history and you see the divine hand making itself felt through history. What's the problem with that? That there are awful historical things that happen, and you have to ask yourself, is that God's presence in history? Which is no, well, that's not God. So then you have to ask yourself, how do I know when it's God's presence in history? How do I know when it's not? And this is not a a theory that speaks to me because I don't want to have to answer that question. I just have better things to think about. But I read Fackenheim. I met Fackenheim. He's a great thinker, extremely erudite, has a great handle on all 19th and 20th century German philosophy. I just disagree with this approach. So revelation is history. It is a very dominant theory for those who studied Hegel. Remember, Hegel talks about the idea of the zeitgeist, that history is the unfolding of God's working God's self out. So from Hegel's perspective, you might say the world is the expression of the divine mind, the divine unconscious. So the world is you might say, the text of the divine mind working itself out. So that had a very strong influence on beginnings of Jewish theology, certain Fackenheim and many others. By the way, I love studying Hegel. There's a lot of wisdom there. But I have a much more dour view of human history than seeing human history as the working out of the divine mind. Many people believe it, including Fackenheim, at least when he wrote that book. Now, Dulles offers then a third understanding of revelation. Revelation as inner experience. God known through religious experience and mystical experience. Let's see. Now, that's very close to my understanding of the divine. I've had mystical experiences. I've studied mysticism. You can read Evelyn Underhill, one of the greatest 20th century scholars of mysticism. Rudolf Otto, O-T-T-O, his book, Das Heilige, the Holy, good English translation, it's called The Holy. So there's a whole literature in mostly German and then in English about the experience of the divine. Now, for those of you who have a more philosophic interest, this fits in with post-Kantian thought of what is called phenomenology, meaning trying to overcome the problem of, does my mind experience reality, meaning my limited senses and the real world? Phenomenology says, let's skip that question and study the experience. So instead of asking, does God exist? And there's no way to prove it one way or the other. You say, well, what does it mean to experience God? What I call the phenomenological experience of God. That's where I'm at. I don't want to wrestle with the question, does God exist? I would rather discuss, what are my experiences of God? What are your experiences of God? Let's talk about it and compare notes. This is what I would call a phenomenological approach to the divine, not so much a theological approach to the divine, if theology is talking about God's existence, divine attributes, and so forth. So this number 3 is very close to me. And again, I recommend it to you, but I really think you ought to read chapter 14 of Cambridge Companion to Jewish Theology, and think about these things and ask yourself, not what does Judaism believe, because Judaism is a is a symphony of 100 different instruments. The question is, which instrument are you playing? What is your understanding of this? Another one is number 4. This is again that Brill is summarizing Dulles. Revelation is dialectical presence. God cannot be known in nature. I believe that's true. Or history, somewhat how I believe, but is known in transcendence and transcendent moral order. Very much part of what I believe. In this way, I am in the idealistic school of philosophy, not idealistic meaning a naive person who believes in ideals, but rather that the world of ideas is real. So, for example, if you look at the thought of Plato, he's an idealist, meaning someone who believes in the reality of ideas. If you look at the resurgence of idealism in Germany, the early German Romantics, very profound literature, people who are aware of the limitations of language trying to experience the infinite. Now, they believe there was an infinite there to experience. They just knew that language was limited. So how do human beings articulate their experience of the infinite in the infinite mind of the human being? Well, the answer was poetry, music, literature, many different human endeavors that try to get closer and closer to the divine, but it's not medieval theological reasoning about the divine, but focused on transcendent experience. So dialectical presence, which means it's a dialogue between the infinite and the finite. Dulles talks about a fifth theory of revelation, revelation as inner awareness. Again, you probably know that that is also something that I experience and teach, meaning revelation, meaning God making God's self apparent, as it were, as a creative, expanded consciousness. Let's see here. I have to move the bar a little bit. And insight, creative, expansive, expanded consciousness and insight. You'll see this in humanistic psychology, certain kinds of philosophy. Roberto Saggioli, by the way, talks about this book in The Act of Will, when you go beyond the strong will, the skillful will, the good will, the transcendent will, and all the way into the universal will. So Saggioli, in his nuts and bolts book on the will in the beginning, turned into a wonderful book on mysticism. So experiencing the divine in one's as a creative force, expanded consciousness, and insight. This is a fifth model. Clearly, they're not mutually exclusive, because I certainly experience almost all of them. Another model of those who believe humanistic positions that do not have a revelation of content. This is called non-propositional theology. And this is very, very common, by the way, among Reform and conservative theologians, or people who think about God. They go to the Bible, they look at Deuteronomy chapter 20, they go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. They know these texts are written at a specific place at a specific time. They have no idea that the divine actually spoke this at Mount Sinai, so let's not try to figure it out. But the idea that the divine, as it were, speaks, if you looked at my Shabbat thought, by the way, I tried to bring down some of these, but especially number 6, that the first experience of God is the divine overflow of God's being into our being. This goes back to Aristotle's theories of being, Plato's theories of being, and in the modern period, different phenomenologists, certainly Martin Heidegger, but that the beginning of the experience of God is not without content, a so-called non-propositional theology, that God is not making propositions, but the beginning is an overflow of divine being into the human being, and from that trying to language it. So for me, this is a process. In my own daily tefillah, in my own daily meditation, I want to experience divine being overflowing itself into my being, and then seeing how I language it. Now, he says it's a humanistic position. That's probably so. I don't see myself as a humanist in a typical sense, but I believe the idea of a non-propositional theology, or a revelation from God that does not have content, but which is the communication of God's being. By the way, I see this in rabbinic literature. I see it in the Zohar, in mystical literature, definitely in rabbinic mysticism, that God reveals God's presence. Only later is it languaged. I believe this is a core rabbinic theology. So when he says it's a humanistic position, I would disagree with him. I would say that this goes back to rabbinic literature, Kabbalistic literature, etc. Now, number 7 is something that I really, really like. I and Sherry, Rabbi Manning, and I have talked about this, although I've never really had a name for it. And so here it is. A model that demonstrates a post-liberal emphasis on the acceptance of the textual tradition. Now, that really does speak to the oratoric culture, everything I just said earlier. I mean, I Rabbi Manning would say, you don't have to figure out a theology. The only axiom you need is there's something called the spiritual part of the human being. You read the text with a certain inner lens. that the inner life is open to the text. And you start to study the text. And we love Zornberg, her archetypal psychology, plus many other things. And therefore, we're devoted to the text. We accept the textual tradition. But the main thing is our interpretive skills. I think I shared with you that when I was studying the Zohar in Tel Aviv with a very gifted teacher, I'd like to teach a lot more about that when we get back to California and I can start scheduling some classes. As we were going into the really lyrical depths of the text, one of the Israeli students said, "Stam pitriot," it's just mushrooms, which is a kind of a dismissive statement of just a mishmash of words that make no sense. And I remember thinking to myself, I get it. If you don't have mystical soul consciousness and you can't see, this is kind of a German romantic position, that the words that you read organize themselves in the soul and take you to the border and beyond the border into the experience of the divine. So I think number 7, and I don't know why this is post-liberal. I see this in William James and Nietzsche, Paul Tillich, for example, who is well within the liberal model. I don't know why he says post-liberal. That you study the text in order, as I said in my Shabbat thought, I think it's worthwhile reading, to discover the God beyond God, the religion beyond religion. You devote yourself to the textual tradition. Why? Because therefore we as a community have something to talk about in common, and let go of any beliefs. Just let the text speak to you and let the text enter in you and respond to the text dialectically. So the fact that he says a post-liberal emphasis on the acceptance of the text, I think one thing that I would like to do, because he doesn't do this in this chapter, is try to integrate all of this into something that, for me, it could be something coherent. So anyway, I put these up here. I finally figured out how to access my website. So I'll put this up on the website by tomorrow. You can look at this. The chapter is very instructive, chapter 14 in the Cambridge Companion. I just don't think it is, I learned a lot, it was great, but I would love to offer an integrated position. And all I've done today is give you some notes on how to integrate this. And I think I am not going to leave this alone as of today. I think what I'm going to do today is introduce it and then promise to work out an integrated position in the future. All right, so I'll stop my share. See if I'm able to do that. Yay. Okay, come back to you, fine folks. Let me just summarize what I hope to do today, and then I'll take any of your questions or comments. I believe that one thing that unifies everybody who comes here on a Shabbos morning, I believe this to be true. Either we believe that there are better and worse answers to moral questions, or we're struggling with it. Because if you were a complete relativist, you'd already not like me by now. So I'm going to assume that. And again, if I'm assuming wrong about you, I apologize. I think we are unified that we assume that people have souls. I think we are not writing out the possibility that there is a divine presence. I think we accept that we can connect to the divine presence. That might be something that either you accept it or you're struggling with it. And I think we might accept that somehow the divine becomes present in the study of the text. Is it in the text? Yeah, I could argue that, but I want to say something more modest. When we bring the interpretive powers of the soul to bear on the text, something of the divine comes through the text and meets us. So I, like many of you, have had very intense spiritual experiences studying the text. By the way, not only with Jewish texts. I mean, I'm visiting, among others, a student of mine with whom I studied many years, including Rilke. And he and I were just reminiscing about when we studied Rilke, we suddenly felt the divine overflow. And that helps me know, it's not that I learned that, but I knew it and I re-experienced it, is that the divine can become apparent in many different profound texts. And for me, especially in certain kinds of poetry, certainly in liturgy, by the way, not just Jewish liturgy. As I've been here in Bavaria, we've actually visited many churches. I picked up Catholic prayer books. I opened them up. It's filled with words of Augustine. And by the way, having St. Augustine in your tradition is a huge benefit. We don't have those kinds of people, but I studied Augustine in graduate school, and I thought what it would mean to sit in a Catholic pew and open up the book and study Augustine and all these others. It's very, very deep. Something when you go into churches, they just have, they're in German, and luckily since I've already read Augustine, I can understand the German, but just incredible passages from Augustine decorating Catholic churches. So do I feel God when I read Augustine? Yeah, the man channeled God from my perspective. So the channeling of God through text is not only in our Bible, it's our Bible. So this is where we channel together. I've experienced this in studying the text of many different religions, but I always come home to mine because this is my home, and I invite other people into my home as well. So what I want to do for all of you is give you some guidance in how do you figure out how you experience the divine coming present. How do you experience God revealing God's self? For you to think about this, and I think if we can be a little bit reflective and coherent about this, how much the better.